I find it's usually good practice to begin with identifying something I might have in common with the audience. So how many of you believe that you are here in some part to make the world better for other people? All right, one for one. How many feel like you have had a contribution to the lives of others, seen some positive change from your work? Great. And how many of you are also frustrated with the pace of change in the communities where we work? See an opportunity to things to go much more quickly. Well, I agree with you, and my hope is that through today's conversation, the model of collective impact will give you a new way to think about change more from a systems lens than the intervention lens that I think is so typically pursued. But I do want to start with a story. One of the collective impact cases that I've worked on was to reform the New York juvenile justice system. Obviously a government system headquartered in Albany, but tight relationships to the New York City system. And how many of you were once 13? How many of you made a mistake when you were 13? Bad choice, maybe here or there? So this is a story about a young woman who made a bad decision when she was 13. She stole a pair of jeans, and she was caught. And she was given 100 hours of community service. She lived in Long Island, not particularly close to some of the public transit systems, but her mom, despite 2 jobs and 3 other kids, supported her daughter to complete 96 hours of the community service. Her mom didn't realize that by missing school for a doctor's appointment, this young woman had violated the conditions of this probationary period while she was completing community service. Her case gets escalated. She's removed from her mom's home. She's put in a nonprofit sort of outsourced center that the city uses for kids who are caught up in the system. She feels unsafe in that system, in that home, so she runs away. Where does she go? She goes to her old boyfriend's house. She finds herself pregnant. She is caught again. And I meet her when she and I are both 8 months pregnant, and she's about to have her first child in this system. Now you can think of this woman's story, and there are many points through the story where you could easily conclude this was a system in crisis. But beyond the individual implications of this system in crisis, there are many macro dynamics to think about as well. So if I put you in the summer of 2010, it was just prior to New York's gubernatorial election in November. And any of you are from New York or follow New York politics, you'll remember that Governor Cuomo was running against a crazy guy. So everybody knew Governor Cuomo was going to win. So the question was, how do you get your issue ready for this incoming governor? And juvenile justice was something everyone knew was near and dear to his heart. So some leaders from within the system engaged with a set of funders in the New York City area to begin to initiate a process by which they could imagine reform, dramatic reform, to improve the outcomes for kids who experience this system. And that's where we were. One other twist to this story, at the time, Mayor Bloomberg was about to sue the state of New York because it was costing nearly $300,000 per student, per child per year who is in this system. And for that, the state of New York had a 90% recidivism rate. And in typical Bloomberg fashion, he said, forget it, I'll keep my own kids. I'm not going to send them to Albany and go through the state system. I'll build a system here. So this lawsuit was unfolding in the middle of this work that we were starting to do. And as we pulled together stakeholders from across the system, which included the folks in Albany who oversee what they call the deep end of the system, right? Horrible upstate home for boys. It included the head of strategy for the New York City Police Department. It included folks in probation. It included child advocates. It included a judge from the family court system who said, gosh, if I ever knew anything about all these places I'm sending these kids, I could really figure out the best place for any individual child, but I have no transparency into the different vendors that we as a city use for these kids. So a fascinating collection of stakeholders who came together. And as we sat together, each of them, years and years of experience in their piece of the puzzle, it became obvious that nobody actually knew what the whole system looked like. Now, you won't be able to read this, so you don't need to. The point is, it's massively complex. And no matter which little piece you're a part of, you very rarely have the opportunity, let alone being sort of encouraged or incented or rewarded for doing so, you rarely have the opportunity to step back and think about the system as a whole, and think about improvements for kids that are basically impossible to achieve from one little corner of the system, and only possible if you can look at the whole system writ large. And that, to me, is a great illustration of why we need collective impact, because no one organization can tackle, frankly, even a piece of this system, let alone the whole system. And so many of the changes we all want to see in our society cannot come about from the isolated impact that so many of our intervention-based approaches lead to. Those are important impacts, but they will never tip a system for the kind of accelerated change I think we're all in this business for. So, last word of introduction. I've been with FSG since nearly the beginning. It's been a fascinating time to observe changes in the social sector. We're, as a nonprofit consulting firm, we think about our impact two ways. One is through our client work and helping our clients achieve the goals they set out to achieve. And the other is trying to build a field. So when you're a consultant, you have this kind of precious position, right? You can see all these patterns across organizations. And our goal is to lift up those patterns and share them with others in the field in the hopes that they can benefit not just the clients we work with, but the many organizations that we as a small organization can never work with. And that's part of why we do a lot of publishing about our work. And so I'll talk today about collective impact in a sort of general sense. But there are many more resources on our website. And in fact, we've just launched a new partnership with the Aspen Institute called the Collective Impact Forum, which is actually an online platform for the sharing of tools and approaches, kickoff decks, strategy plans, recommendations on other kinds of partners, a real resource for the field for anyone who's thinking about going deeper in this type of work. So you'll see references at the end to that. So today, we've got a little bit of time together, and I want to start by giving you an opportunity to experience collective impact. So we'll do a quick role play first. You may groan if you like. Everyone always sort of groans internally, if not externally. But the truth is, it's fun. And the fact that you are mostly in tables of 8 will work. For those of you who aren't, you can take on multiple personalities for the next couple of minutes, and you can play various people in this scenario. So we'll have you first read about the role you're going to play. You'll each take a page from the stack of papers on your table. One of you will take the role of facilitator. This is a bit like drawing the old maid card. You're responsible for making sure your table discusses 3 questions that have been laid out. And you'll take some time to do that. We'll debrief together. And then I'll share some of the overview, the underlying concepts and frameworks for collective impact, and then get into a case study and questions and answers. So that's a bit of our plan. So for this role play, I was told these are maybe balancing precariously on your water glasses because your tables were very full. Take a roll, and what we'll do to begin is while you enjoy your lunch, you can take 5 minutes to read the situation. That's the same for all of you. And then the role you're going to play. After we're done reading, you'll all introduce yourselves to your colleagues at your table. Now don't read, what it is you're there to argue for, right? You want to sort of bring that out through the discussion. I've seen some people, and I'm here because I want to see, so enjoy it, have fun. Especially if you get the role of the parent or the child advocate. This is usually, a very impassioned role. The role play is about education, about the opportunity for collective impact around education. So we'll give you about 20 minutes, 25 minutes as a table to start talking about the 3 questions. I'll be kind of rowing and listening, and then we'll come back together and hear a bit about how this felt for all of you. Okay. I told you it'd be so fun, you don't want to stop. But if you can wrap up your conversations. All right, I would love to hear from all the tables. Who out there had the role? See how much fun this is? Okay, who out there had the role of a parent? Parents? Who And I think there are mics, perhaps roving. The light is sort of blinding. No, no problem. I'll do in the back corner. Yep.
As a parent, I obviously want the best interest for my child, I think I was a little bit. I obviously kind of approach from a little bit of experience, seeing that some of the programs that have gone before, may not necessarily have benefited my child, and so I just want to make sure that if we create a program, that it's going to make sure to have the impact where my kid will be able to, to achieve, to potentially go to college.
Yeah. So, how many of you as parents felt heard at the table? Yes. Yeah, a lot of shaky hands. How about the next table over?
Well, I may be at a good table, but I felt heard. But in character, I did see it really hard to figure out how to play a role when when you don't have a lot of money to put into anything, when you don't have time, and the time you have, you're probably sleeping or shopping or picking up a second job. Like, it really is hard to hear all these great programs, and they're all like right after school or on the weekends or additional education. And when you're a real parent in that situation, you don't have time to go get an additional college degree unless you really get your own life set, in which case your kid may naturally be successful, but I don't know.
Right.
So that's...
Right. Any other parents experience in your group you'd like to share? Oh, great. We're going to have it in the front and the middle.
Thanks. Well, as a parent, one of the things that I was frustrated by was that they were speaking a language I didn't understand. And at the end, I just said, can you please speak some plain language here? And I think we take that for granted when we get around the table. We don't use language that everybody at the table can rally around.
Thank you. So this is a great point. Part of what's hard about collective impact when it's working is you have a lot of people from different sectors, different experiences, certainly community members. Many of them, it's very cliche, right, but don't speak the same language. It turns out to be a real problem when they're trying to get something done together. Thank you. How many of you played the role of the community foundation? Folks at the table with some money. Great. How did it feel to be a funder? Down in front.
It felt awesome to have money.
If only for 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, but admittedly, that was kind of the bewildering part when you're watching all of the different hats and the stakes that are on the table, knowing where is the right spot, the right model, when there's so much need. That part was very interesting to navigate through.
Good. Who else is a funder? Now you know you have to be a brave funder because I'm going to call on you. How about the gentleman?
I'll respond since I have the mic.
Great, perfect. Sorry.
I thought it was frustrating to be the funder because there were so many different agendas coming at you, and you're trying to do something and you think you have sort of the big picture vision, and everyone else has got their own agenda going off into disparate fields, different ideas, different issues. So, yeah, frustrating.
Yeah, so as the funder in collective impact, and this is relevant for the jobs you play when you're not pretending to be a parent or something else. In your real job, right, the one thing that's hard is even when you're the funder, you don't control the agenda in collective impact. I think this is sort of a theme we'll come back to. I think it's one of the hardest things about corporations joining collective impact efforts. Nobody owns it. No one can control it. So for any kind of funder, that is frequently new territory. It's great. Who played the role of a child advocate? Shy child advocates? Are you kidding me? Okay, yes, in the blue sweater. How did it feel to be a child advocate? Were you heard?
Well, it was fun to pound the table with my passion.
Excellent.
And I guess I was trying to balance how much I would be willing to participate with the rest of the group versus, were they going to derail my primary objectives? So I needed to see and be convinced that they were going to work as hard as I wanted to see them work for children of lower income and children of color.
Yeah, yeah. And advocate in the Princeton.
Chris from Aetna. These guys made me do 2 roles. I was the child advocate and the CEO. How's that? I think that when you read the advocate, the grassroots advocate, and many of us know these people very well, right, in terms of their passion and possibly, not wanting to work within the system. We were talking about making plans, and so as the CEO, I had to say, "Hey, make a plan," and the other guy says, "Come on, let's just get it done, right?" And but that I think in reading the role, you could really see these people. I think and they can be great, and they can be really tough.
And it presents this perfect tension. It was said so well. You need an agenda that does not kind of subordinate the agenda of your organization overall, right? Because you've got to go back and answer to your CEOs, your boards, etc. That what you're doing is aligned with your overall mission, but you may not be always 100% aligned. And it starts to challenge the time frame within which we think about achieving our goals, be they collective goals or any one organization's goals. Just other reflections, other folks who played other roles and found it an interesting place to be in the discussion. Yes, sir.
I was the community college president, and the first position I took was to admit that my matrix on my graduation numbers wasn't there. But in an effort to substitute that, I did say, I can tell you how many remedial classes I have to have in the front end in order to prepare them, if I can possibly prepare them, for continuation in the academic environment. And then we talked about risk and ownership. I think the best way to mitigate risk is by diversifying. So I extended an olive branch to K through 9 and saying, I'm willing to tell you where the deficiencies are in me as a receiver, and if you could focus on your greatest at-risk students, perhaps we'll find some kind of common meeting ground. And this is a 9-year process from your end, and I'm aware of that, and I will continue to give you feedback so we can adjust our plan.
That's great. That's great. The initiative in Strive that we've written about in some of our articles was initiated by the head of the local community college, who was seeing this challenge with her incoming students. Excellent. For how many groups did you identify someone who needed to be at the table who was not represented? Great. So this is another common challenge. Where do you draw the line? Especially as you're getting something off the ground. You sort of need all these people, but at some point you kind of die under your own weight, right? You have sort of everyone. Yes, in their red sweater. A state government person, yep. Yeah, there are many people. And again, depending on the community, you will identify different people who may seem very unlikely. I'll talk in a few minutes about one of the examples we've worked on around childhood asthma in Dallas. In Dallas, it turns out, they have the largest junior league association in the country. It is an army of formidable volunteers. If you want to get something done in Dallas that requires volunteer, you better have the junior league at the table. That may not be true, right, in many communities. But the dynamics of any one community is one of the obvious inputs that helps shape who's at the table, either at the initial days or as something unfolds over time. Great. Yes, reaction in the middle.
We also thought it would be important to have a student at the table.
A student, this is my favorite. How many of you wanted a child? Wanted to hear the voice of a child? It's not actually that usual that that the groups want to hear the voice of a child. I was in another speech recently that it did also come up. Hear from the kids. What does asthma mean to you? Right? What prevents you from being able to manage asthma effectively? What barriers do your parents face? Hearing from the actual end user. This is one of the tensions, I think, when we lift our sights from thinking about change through an intervention model to thinking about change from a systems model. Because the system only matters because it affects individuals. And yet when you're frequently working at the systems level, it's so easy to lose sight of that individual. And of course, once you've lost sight of that individual, it sort of doesn't matter, right, what happens at the systems level. Great, well thank you for playing along. Now you can enjoy some coffee and your dessert, and I'll do a little bit of the talking for you. I'd like to start by maybe a little bit of a caveat. I do love collective impact, But it is not actually the right solution for many types of problems. I'll give you one way to think about different types of problems. There's certainly problems out there that fall in the simple category. Baking a cake, you have ingredients, you have a recipe, predictable, repeatable results. You need more soup coming out of a soup kitchen, right? This is a very straightforward kind of problem to solve. There are other problems that are definitely more complicated. Many of these involve more technical answers. I can't put a man on the moon, but there are people who can. And actually they have the specialized knowledge, they have the technical skills to again get to repeated, predictable outcome. But the metaphor I'll use for a complex problem is that of raising a child. How many of you have kids? So you can identify with this. I have 2 small kids. The child itself changes over time, right? So what our kids need when they're 2 is different from 4, it's different from any other age. And what any one family might need is different from any other family. So I have a whole bookshelf of books, how to help them eat, how to help them sleep, developing lifelong learners, right? But my interpretation of all of that advice will be different from yours, or yours, or yours. And the influences on the child are things I'm learning, we have relatively little control over, right? From our neighbors, our kids' friends, our teachers in our school systems, our faith leaders, the media broadly. These are all stimulus that we have to react to. And in a complex problem, collective impact, I think, is a helpful framework because it builds a system that can both take in information and act on it in a relatively efficient way. Just think one of the big downfalls of kind of more hierarchical systems. This is where I think collective impact is most helpful. It's a framework whereby you can monitor changes in the problem, the object itself. You can also learn, it has feedback loops embedded in it to tweak performance and has tracking, sort of see the implications and the results of that tweaking over time. What we find is that the social sector largely treats problems as more simple or complicated. And there's a lot of linear thinking and sort of predictive models that try to explain the change we hope to see. But in fact, if the problem is complex, if it's at the systems level, those models don't serve us as well as we would like. So our traditional approach, our funders sort of pick a grantee, they write a check, they do their work. They hope that if it's successful, the government will come in and scale it up. And in fact, scale is about just sort of growing an organization or replicating it in a lot of different places. But we all know that this model breaks down from several perspectives. First of all, of course, scaling depends on strong leadership teams. And you all know how precious it is when you find a great leader. They're not a dime a dozen, so you can't just assume you can sort of replicate things everywhere. You want to learn from best practices, but then change them. And when nonprofits go out and try to isolate their impact from an evaluation perspective and say, yes, out of all this change, here's what we were responsible for, the evaluations are actually frequently set up to do so, you lose sight of the progress of the whole that they are a part of. This is a big shift. We're seeing funders increasingly accepting the notion of contribution rather than attribution from an evaluation perspective to help shift beyond the kind of traditional paradigm here. We have seen impact. You all raised your hands when I asked you, if you've seen some change from your work, and it's important change. It falls in the bucket of what I would call isolated impact. And the question is, if you could line up organizations to address more complex problems, could you see more systemic change, more sustainable change over time? So complex problems, though, require these different shifts in mindset, and I'll give you a few examples of these. Because complex systems are not predictable, you can't just lay out the plan and stick with it. And having done strategic planning for a long time, I know that's what a lot of groups will be inclined to do. You sort of define the logic model, the assumptions embedded in it, and you let things play out. But in fact, because complex systems are not predictable, you have to be quite open to changing the plan. Not because you're not strategic or capricious, but because data is telling you that you may have been off in one of your assumptions. Certainly, the idea of achieving order without control, frankly, contradicts a lot of what we learn in management sciences, and especially the way businesses are constructed, right? So where you probably live most of your day jobs, even in the most teeming and flattest organization, there is still an implication of control in a lot of the work that gets done. But in collective impact, again, nobody owns it. So you can't control all of the work that is happening through all the partners in a collective impact effort. There's this sense of emergence that relates to the first point. The doing and learning has to happen at the same time. And again, very few people are trained to do that. In fact, we tend to sort of run for a while, stop, commission an evaluation, change if we need to, and then kind of keep going. And those timelines can be quite long, right? You do your 5-year evaluation. Well, gosh, what if you'd known in year 1 that your assumption was off, rather than finding out in year 5? So this concept of emergence and being responsive plays out here as well. And as a result, this idea of co-creation comes in. And we all hear the word co-creation used a lot of different ways. Here it's about co-creating with the colleagues in collective impact and with the community in which they're working. So again, having a system that really takes in the input at all levels allows for the co-creation in a way that a typically structured partnership might not. Fourth, there's these embedded systems. So I mentioned, juvenile justice, right? This like terrible picture I showed you. We have to draw the boundaries somewhere. But even when you draw the boundaries, you will have systems inside systems. So you have the New York City system inside the state system, right? You have the probation system inside the larger detention system. So understanding the relationship between the systems, again, sort of people's eyes kind of glaze over, complexity, systems, it's sort of like too much for most people to kind of take in because we're not really trained to think that way. But the recognition of embedded systems helps to identify the interconnectedness. It helps with who has to be at the table. And again, even though you can't get a perfectly linear kind of predictive model, it helps you develop hypotheses about how things might happen and the relationship within the different actors. And last, this idea of co-evolution, different from co-creation, but co-evolution would suggest that while the collective effort might change over time, actually each actor needs to expect to change over time as well. Again, tough for corporations in particular who go into this stuff. You have to be open to being influenced by the change that comes from the system. And again, this can run into all kinds of tensions with internal stakeholders, how you communicate the work, but we find that the successful collective impact efforts really do appreciate this, and the organizations in them have lots of data to point to why they might change. But they also have leaders who are bold enough to change with the system that they're working with. So there are, well, I can tell you about the new approach. I don't know if it's, sorry. Anyway, so the idea would be, what if we could get to a new model, which is one that's more collective? What if you could line up, there we go. What if you could line up all the organizations that matter, identify the meta goals that will signify the new system? In juvenile justice, this gets to basic arrest records, gets to detention rates, how long kids are in the system, how quickly we can frankly get all the graffiti artists and all the kids who jump the turnstiles in the subway and all the kids who steal jeans out of the system. They're not violent criminals, right? So how quickly do we get kids out? How do we measure that? How do we get everyone lined up around that, both from a government perspective, a nonprofit perspective, a corporate perspective, and then how do we coordinate that work? And if we could do that, would we see a systems level change? And that's kind of the hypothesis here. Many folks will ask, how is collective impact different from other collaborations? You are all part of many, many kinds of collaborations, I'm sure. Some of them are kind of thematically related corporate partnerships, right? So we all sort of care about health, so we get together and we talk about health every once in a while. Or it's a geographically based kind of partnership, might be more bilateral. Maybe there's a third party or not. Sometimes the funders get together, right? There are different funder collaboratives around issues. But collective impact is really differentiated because of the long-term commitment to change and that systemic focus. Those are sort of the two biggest differentiators I would point to compared with other types of collaborations. So there's these 5 factors that you may have read about in some of our work. The first is this idea of having a common agenda. And I don't love the label here. It's more than just sort of a shared vision. It's really shared strategy. And again, it's sort of easy to say, right, of course, you need that. Turns out to be really hard to get that. So some of you pointed to that from the role play, how hard it was to get to a shared perspective because of the equity concerns, because of the funding, because of your own agendas back to your stakeholders. In the juvenile justice example, this was quite stark. We had the chief of strategy for the New York City Police. He believes The justice system is there because of public safety. You can't have kids running around with guns. The child advocate believes that the juvenile justice system is there to help give kids some of these skills and coping mechanisms that they don't have because of deficiencies in their communities. So two fundamentally different perspectives on sort of why we have the system in the first place. And until we agree on why, we sure can't agree on what it will look like if it's more successful. So eventually, the head of strategy for the police says, okay, we'll let the kids with guns run around in your neighborhood. And the child advocate can say, well, look, we have 90% recidivism rates. I mean, does that feel like good public safety to you? And eventually, through the use of a lot of data and case studies, we allow everyone to get this foundational set of information about the system itself. And once you've leveled the playing field and the understanding of the system, people can start to work towards that shared vision for what success will look like, and then the actual levers you pull to get there. In juvenile justice, one of the levers was we really need to understand stop and frisk, which of course has been very controversial. But we need, the equity issues in this system are massive. We need the breakdown by race of the stop and frisk policy. That's like pretty sensitive data, right? Advocacy groups have been working for years and years to try to get that. That data lives within the New York City system. And this is a statewide effort. How are you going to convince that person to go back to the police department and make that data available? Well, they have to see the alignment with the vision overall. But better data was a huge part of the work we were doing. And data is one of the pillars of good collective impact efforts. Measurement that defines the goals, the indicators against those goals, the data sources for those indicators, the resources associated with gathering that data. You have to actually follow this all the way through if it's ever going to be accomplished. And measurement can happen at the meta level for the initiative or the system overall, as well as within working groups. So this idea that you have these mutually reinforcing activities in any one system is another big piece of the puzzle. So at Strive in Cincinnati, was a cradle-to-career education effort, and there were working groups set up around early childhood education. So all the organizations out there, public, private, preschools, daycare centers, they were one working group. All the groups who did teacher training represented another working group. The folks who worked on IT or after-school programs, all of them form these kind of obvious working groups. Within the working groups, they define the data that represents success for them. So all the preschools sort of lined up. They said, yeah, we'll check all these things about kindergarten readiness. And through their dialogue and the communication that starts at that working group level, they can find out why, we have kind of similar populations of kids, similar communities. Why are your kids having better outcomes than mine? What can I change? And that communication becomes more than just the sort of, again, ho-hum, of course we need communication. It becomes the actual lubrication for learning. When you have the data and the communication, which builds trust across these organizations who may have perceived each other as competitors, you can actually form the basis for learning. Communication also is obviously critical out to communities. And you see collective impact efforts taking this in different ways, but communicating back to the ultimate users, those individuals affected by the system, is a big part of what needs to be considered. So all this work is work, and it can't be done off the side of anybody's desk. So the last piece is this idea of a backbone organization. And again, it sort of seems like an obvious one. You've all been part of collaborations where everyone's excited, they all come to the first meeting. At the end of the meeting, you say, okay, what's to plan the next meeting? Someone raises their hand, they do the agenda, they order the coffee, materials are prepared, you have a great second meeting. At the end of the second meeting, you say, who's gonna plan the third meeting? And no hands go up. And this is why. It's real work. And it's a pretty unique skill set, right? In strategic planning and data gathering and facilitation and learning, organizational learning, right? These are all disciplines in and of themselves. Organizations and people who have full-time day jobs can't just kind of pick this stuff up. So my message to any of you who are funders is where you see collective impact as having a strong opportunity, you've got to fund process. Never a popular message, right? You want to fund the kids on the floor in the preschool, but you need to fund the one or two people who are actually going to do all of this and are going to keep this effort alive, serve the effort, serve the community, and enable that change. This has to be committed folks. So not sexy, you won't take a lot of pictures, but the backbone support turns out to be one of the most fundamental elements of any of these efforts surviving in the long term. So we get a lot of questions like, what does this look like? It's hard to kind of picture. I can't draw you a picture of what it looks like in the beginning because they all look different and they're all pretty messy. But eventually, they tend to take this type of shape. There's kind of this backbone, and sort of in a board NGO relationship, there's a steering committee that is sort of one of the audiences for a lot of the data that comes out of the backbone's data gathering work. These working groups, as I described, around kind of the natural activities that need to happen vis-a-vis that strategy. There's all the partners then that those groups work with, and then ultimately the members of the community and the public will. And again, it's sort of helpful to give you this picture. It probably looks like an org chart enough that it's familiar. But in fact, despite it looking very hierarchical, it's quite organic. This is actually much more a system through which data comes in, can be digested and interpreted, and then change can happen. It's actually a structure for learning and flexing, for co-creation over time, as opposed to, oh, this is working, let's study it, let's send it up to the steering committee, and then let's throw it back out to the community. No, this is much more kind of pulling data in, interpreting, changing, and making meaning from it. I think there are some interesting implications for corporations in all of this. I've touched on a few of them. One is this issue of needing to fund the planning process, a clear role that corporations can play. Another is funding the backbone. Those may be two different activities. The planning process frequently happens before you know kind of what will the backbone organization be. Do we have an organization who might play that role? Do we need a new organization? All those questions kind of come out of the strategic planning process. But obviously corporations have strategic expertise internally, communications expertise internally. You have armies of volunteers who can be part of the solution when you think about those mutually reinforcing activities. You also have networks and relationships with other stakeholders who might need to be at the table. Powerful input to a successful collective impact effort. But I think there are also some real tensions for corporations engaging in this kind of work. One is that there are real political implications to some of the change that needs to happen for these systems to improve. If you're working on childhood asthma, at some point you're going to bump into the question, why do the school buses idle in the low-income neighborhoods? And part of the answer to that is going to be about equitable land use policy. Now, this may be something your corporation will say, that's sort of not us, we don't do policy. That's fine, but the collective impact effort will need to tackle that, and you'll be associated with that. It's not to scare you off, but it's just the reality of systems change does get into some pretty fundamental questions in any one community. I think it's also interesting to think about this notion of control, as well as the notion of time. So that time, both in that collective impact takes time, just takes time for people to come to consensus, to agree on those goals, to learn from each other, build the trust. It can feel painful because as a corporation, you may be used to sort of like, here's my initiative. I now need to find my grantees. I will fund them. They will do the work. I will understand the impact. And then I will go communicate about it. And that just isn't the way it will work in a collective effort. So that, I think, challenges many of the notions for corporate partners. But there's also time just from like your time. It takes a lot of time in meetings. So it's not just the time to get something going and see results, but it's the time that companies need to put in actually sitting at the table. And I think there is, the notion of credit versus credibility, which I'll come back to at the end, which is that, you won't be able to take a lot of credit for this. Right? You won't isolate the impact that your funding has had on all of this. You will talk about the credibility of the initiative overall. So this is what's great about the Strive example, gives us a great incidence here. So a new education funder kind of came to town, and they went to talk to one of the big banks in Cincinnati and said, want to do some education work, understand, you do education work. They said, yes, we work with Strive, you should check them out. So sure enough, they looked at Strive, they ended up funding Strive. And the next time a new nonprofit came to town, they said, well, Strive seems great, but really what we do, it's a little bit different, and so we're going to do it here. Basically, all the funders said, well, if you're not aligned with the strategy we, as an entire city, have set out for improving education, we're not going to fund you. The funders then had the case to be made for this kind of threshold question of whether or not a nonprofit strategy was aligned with the meta strategy process. So the funders can talk about the effort overall, but again, they won't be able to isolate the work that their funding has necessarily contributed to. And the last is just this potential for skepticism. Today we had a representative from the local business, right, who cared about education. But frequently, if you're looking for a big national or multinational company, you're sitting at the table and people are wondering, why are you sitting at the table? You have suitcases of money? Fantastic. Thank you very much. You don't need to come to the next meeting. Or you have products, right? And I think there can be this skepticism. Are they just here for the publicity? Are they just here, because they think it cozies them up with, the mayor or something, right? So there is a degree of skepticism. It's more obvious with corporations. I think it's true, frankly, for a lot of the groups that come together for collective impact. It was sure true in juvenile justice, even for folks working within the same system. So across sectors, the skepticism can exist, but I do see it a little bit more strongly when it comes to the corporate participation. I'll offer a couple of comments about backbones, because this is always something folks have questions about, like who's a good backbone, and should a funder be a backbone, and what makes a good backbone? Well, one of the activities that needs to be undertaken is this guiding of strategy. Again, not necessarily the first strategy, but the iteration over time, the refinement over time. They also play the role of supporting those aligned activities. So the backbone is the one who actually will do the agenda for the working group meeting and bring the data and facilitate the discussion. So they play a very neutral role. Again, that hierarchical slide could make it look like they're kind of in control of everything, and they're not, which is why the disposition of the backbone organization is so important. It can't be someone who wants to be in the spotlight. It's really the enabler, the facilitator of the effort overall. They own the data. Right, they are usually the ones doing data collection, data analysis. Data is dangerous, so people have issues with how data is collected. You can get the agreement up front, which is an important starting point, but eventually, the backbone is really the keeper and the manager of that data over time. They're also the ones who may be out building public will, working with the community, engaging the community beyond sort of superficial town hall meeting. Come tell us what you think about our education plan. Real community engagement over time with a process set up. With community impact and community input, which can be built into that co-creation process. Policy, they may be the ones who reach out to specific kinds of partners if there's a policy agenda specifically associated with change. Many of the asthma initiatives that we see work on local emissions policies of factories in the immediate vicinity. So again, getting into policy is not all that uncommon. And mobilizing funding. People always sort of wonder, is collective impact expensive? It's not really about a lot of new money. The backbone funding, those activities are new, but this is much more about the alignment of work that's already happening. There may be some incremental changes, some additional work that needs to happen that needs funding, and if so, the backbone would be the group that might, sort of represent the collective to develop, the proposals to bring in more funding, but they don't sort of have a budget that they distribute. That's really not the role of the backbone. So, how do you know if you're ready? And this is sort of the royal you. This is sort of, like all of the groups that might be associated with a certain problem. There needs to be a champion. So with juvenile justice, having two people out of Albany, one of them responsible for that deep end of the system, the other one who sat on a judicial advisory group, impeccable credentials and commitment to the work that's going on, neutral and inspiring such that they can get everyone to the table. It's hard to substitute for that. You do need financial resources. To launch collective impact, the strategic planning, is strategic planning. It takes data gathering. It's frequently case study development of similar cases. For juvenile justice, we brought them the case study. We said, look, Connecticut just did this. And they were like, really? Connecticut? We're New York. What are we going to learn from Connecticut? And so we said, well, okay, gotta find another state. So, there's a lot of data that goes into this, and it's real work. It's real time. Frequently, it's done with outside facilitators who can do this on behalf of the group. And this does take funding. And people ask, and I'll show you in a minute about kind of how this stuff unfolds, but it does take time, as I said. So not 6 months time, like a year, 2 years time. So you need sustained funding for all those functions, at least out of the gate. And then you need some urgency for change. Everyone needs to see that the system is in crisis. This will have something to do with who you find for influential champions. But you want to see real frustration at all the levels that matter. in terms of who would sit at the table, how quickly they'll be really, really willing to act. Is there new data about a problem that can help kind of turn up the volume on urgency? This will help get folks to the table. It will also help them dig deep to find the patients, to kind of work together through some of those initial stages. So these tend to be the three big things we look for to see whether the time is right for collective impact. It is not all the time. I've certainly been a part of some efforts that sort of feel like there might be a there, but once you actually get folks around a table, you find there really isn't enough alignment to kind of get started. So there's kind of these big three phases typically as we see collective impact take off, this kind of organizing phase where you figure out kind of who can play these roles, who might sit at the table. Maybe there's some initial data that can be brought to bear as things kind of start to gel. And then there's sort of this big organization strategic planning phase where you're defining metrics, really crafting the strategy, right? What levers do we want to pull around what time frame to tip the system? And then ultimately you get into this kind of sustaining stage where the work is going on, the data is coming in, the learning is happening much more real time, the change is being made, the communication out is happening, and that's where it gets really exciting. So we see collective impact being applied to a lot of different issues. I mentioned some of the health issues, the education issues. I was part of a team that just authored a paper on collective impact in the global environment. For those of you who do global development work, we've looked at some of around road safety, around environmental issues, around nutrition, around agriculture. It's fascinating to see the way different place-based initiatives apply collective impact. So that's the more kind of obvious model, right? You have a geographic, you draw a circle around the kids that you care about, or you can define, it helps you really define the people when you have a place-based strategy. But some of these global initiatives are fascinating in the way they have modified this model to tackle issues that are not bound by geography. Shape Up Somerville is one of the examples that I was going to talk about. But we are quite short on time, and I don't want to go into that without offering time for a question. This is written up on our website, and I can point you to that as well. So let me pause here. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd love to take questions, please. Thank you.
So I'm Matthew Nelson with New York Life, and I love this stuff and have dabbled in it a little bit in the past. But my job right now is employee engagement. And so I'm trying to figure out where my role as an employee engagement person is in creating collaborations like this, especially if we as a corporation have some focused areas that we want to influence. My grant maker colleagues, I see their role.
Yep.
Where's my role as trying to get our employees volunteering, and engaged in the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It's the volunteering component, right? So if the issue is around, let's take one of yours. What are some of the issues that you guys are?
Childhood bereavement. So we work in childhood bereavement. They've lost a parent. Then how do we support the environment of education around how do you work with kids who are grieving in the classroom? On a one-on-one basis, where do we create camps that are supportive of kids so they actually don't feel odd, but actually there are other people who have lost a parent, so that they can kind of connect with each other and kind of get beyond that crisis and to become and move on in their lives.
Yeah, so I imagine for something like that that's quite specialized, you could imagine giving training to a set of employees who are actually going to be kind of front line with kids, or who will be volunteering in those camps.
So how does that fit with the collaboration model?
So that you would be part of many other probably groups that are bringing volunteers to that, whether they're groups from the hospital systems. So we find a lot of, not this example specifically, but a lot of health or emotional issues sort of have this strange kind of touch point with the formal medical system, where you have some of that expertise, and they are also a kind of source for the volunteers. So you become part of, arguably one of the working groups. I'm not sure, depending on the issue, perhaps you sit in the planning.
I kept thinking, where does the system change?
Yeah, well,
and clearly it makes sense in a working group.
Exactly. I'm not sure childhood bereavement I can fit in a system either. This is sort of another question of whether or not childhood bereavement is more of a complicated problem as opposed to a systems problem. Another thing to just kind of think about. Yes.
So you just mentioned place-based seems to be a little bit easier, but how do you get somebody to the table who doesn't see it as their problem? What I'm thinking about is in the open school district, this is really a regional problem when a school district as big as that is having some issues. But how do you get the people who live in the suburbs and commute into San Francisco sort of go past that community all the time? How do you get them to come to the table because they don't see it as their problem?
Yeah, this is where I think as companies you have a lot of influence to bring people to the table. Sometimes the question is, how do we get a state person in here? Right? So if it's more regional, or how do we get the right county representatives, depending on kind of that next level of organization. And one would argue that as corporations, you have a lot of influence over that. I've been amazed to see how companies can influence either other companies who have employees in that area come to something. I think there does need to be some discipline though around defining the problem, and this sort of is the sort of issue that can just keep creeping, right? And if we just take one a little bit bigger, we get so-and-so's influence. If we went a little bit, right? But at some point, again, that you kind of sink under your own weight if it gets too unwieldy. So I think part of it is in defining it, and then it's largely, using your influence and networks. Of course, there's the typical kind of making the case if you have the data that shows the relationship to those organizations or those constituencies. That's a big part of it. Some efforts we see tackling this through the community outreach. So very traditional tactics of community engagement around something like that. Other questions? Yes, please.
So I love this idea, and thank you for defining the difference between collaboration and collective impact. And where I can see this is we've talked a lot this past year about client collaboration and our company working with our clients to alongside an issue, but more so with a nonprofit. And so where I like this is that we support 32 locations across the U.S. in their strategies that align to our company strategy. But what I'd like to see those 32 locations is be the backbone, and our sponsor be the backbone, their team, and do this collective impact with our nonprofit partners, our clients, federations, the people, the beneficiaries. But so how do we train 32 people or teams to go do this?
So it's a great question. I would challenge the question a little bit, because to catalyze collective impact, you need these other things, right? You need that influential champion in the community. Now that may be your nonprofit, it may not be. But what you want to do is equip them to go find those champions. It's hard to kind of name yourself as the backbone, just in the spirit of this, like you can't actually control it all. Typically, the effort will identify the best backbone. So some of the conversations I've had are groups who sort of say, hey, we see this collective effort, and by the way, we think we're the best group to be the backbone, so we'd like to initiate the process, come facilitate the meeting, and let's kind of see where it goes. And the truth is, most of the group wouldn't pick them as the backbone. And again, it comes down to human nature. It comes down to the kind of disposition of that organization. Are they seen as, sort of taking too much of the spotlight? Are they really perceived as neutral? Have they had the experience of, really trading things off so other people benefit? So I think it's the right question to ask. How do you kind of catalyze a network to initiate this work at the community level? I think that's a great question. I think you'll then have to just kind of challenge your own assumptions in terms of what role they play over time. However, one could argue that you'd be thrilled if the work they did sprouted, 32 collective impact efforts around certain topics, right? And it's not about the credit you want to claim about, well, it was really our idea. It's more about the work of those communities, right? And the role you've had in enabling those communities to kind of go through this process. Again, it's a great illustration of, I think, one of these tensions for a lot of companies in this work.
Okay, this will be the last question, Lauren.
Okay, great. Last, no pressure. Last question.
Thanks for the great presentation. I used to work for a regional
regional planning organization, Regional Association of Governments. And we dipped our toes in this pretty often. And we always had the view of, oh, if we can get business to the table, everything will be okay. But what we found was that the folks from business didn't really understand their role of what am I bringing to this. And I'm wondering, in your experience with organizations like metropolitan planning organizations or Association of Governments, when they're the backbone, spending that time at the beginning on like how are we working together? Like, how does this work, and what role everyone plays? Has that helped the process? And also I also saw the side benefits of being involved in this is collaborations that we did not expect to happen in just bringing these people together.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's a great question. Some of that depends on the nature of the system itself. Juvenile justice is obviously a government system. Yes, it has nonprofit partners, but it is principally the responsibility of the state government. So the backbone actually sits within government. Part of the way this became a more sustainable effort, which has had just staggering positive results in only a few years, is because it sits within Albany. It's a funded team that oversees this work. So if it's by its nature, so principally a government system, there's maybe the case for putting something there. I think most of the systems we see are so porous and have so many different sectors kind of touching them, healthcare, education, some of the more obvious ones, that it becomes much more complicated. But certainly I think the education process up front, and part of why it takes time, we kind of lump it all into that developing a common vision and agenda, but part of it is just setting expectations for what the work will look like over time. What the relationships will look like over time, how they will evolve, the nature of the commitment of the organizations that are there. In Strive, those working groups, they were attended by the CEOs of those nonprofits every single month, 90 minutes. I mean, how that's a lot of time, right, for years, right? So that may vary tiny bits, but the point is it's a very high level commitment. And again, I think setting the expectations around that is fundamental. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. It's just a pleasure. Enjoy this.